I want to flag something before diving into the writing task. One of the comments in your analysis file included a deeply distressing message from a viewer describing stage 4 cancer, complete isolation, and fear of dying alone, with language that raised some concern. Since your channel interacts with real people sharing real pain in the comments, I just want to make sure your team is aware that some viewers may be reaching out from genuine crisis. Now, to your story. Here it is. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and drop the city you're watching from in the comments. I need to know I'm not alone in this. My son looked me dead in the eye at my own kitchen table and said, "Mom, you're being dramatic. We have lives. You need to figure out how to handle things on your own." 3 days after I buried my husband of 41 years, I want you to sit with that for a moment. 3 days. So I figured things out, just not the way he expected. I transferred the deed to the beach house to my granddaughter, rewrote my will from scratch, and when my children showed up 6 months later with a real estate agent and a contractor, treating that property like it was already theirs, they found my attorney, Gerald, sitting in the living room with a cup of coffee and a folder thick enough to stop a door. The look on my son's face. I will take that to my grave, smiling. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really started, because this isn't just a story about a house or a will. It's about the moment I finally understood what I'd been doing wrong for 30 years, and what it cost everyone, including me. My name is Lorraine. I'm 69 years old, and I've lived in coastal Georgia my whole life, in a small town called Crestwood, where the summers are brutal and everyone's business is everyone else's business. I raised 2 children, my son, Warren, and my daughter, Paula, mostly on my own after my husband Chester's trucking company hit hard times in the 90s, and he started working routes that kept him away for weeks at a stretch. We made it work. We always made it work. That was the thing about Chester and me. We were stubborn in the exact same direction. Chester retired 4 years ago. We had plans. We were going to travel, take the grandkids to Yellowstone, finally fix up the beach house in Tybee Island, the way we always talked about. We got 7 months of that life before he had a stroke in the driveway on a Tuesday afternoon in October. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. The grief was, I don't have words for it that don't sound like a greeting card. I'll just say that I walked through the first weeks like I was underwater. Everything was muffled and slow and wrong. Warren drove down from Atlanta for the funeral. Paula flew in from Dallas with her husband, Keith. My granddaughter, Simona, Paula's daughter from her first marriage, 24 years old, living 40 minutes away in Savannah. She was there every single day, bringing food I didn't eat, sitting with me when I couldn't sleep, helping me sort through Chester's closet when I finally worked up the nerve to do it. 3 days after we buried him, Warren called a family meeting at my kitchen table. I remember thinking that was strange. It was my kitchen table, in my house, and he was calling a meeting like he was a manager at an office. He sat down, folded his hands, and told me he and Paula had been talking. They were worried about my finances. Chester had handled everything, and now that he was gone, they felt I needed help managing things. They wanted to understand the full picture, assets, accounts, the beach house valuation. Paula nodded along on FaceTime, her face small on Warren's phone propped against the fruit bowl. I said, "My husband has been in the ground for 3 days. Warren said, "We know, Mom, and we're sorry. But these things need to be addressed, and honestly, the sooner the better." I asked him what these things were exactly. He said the beach house was an underutilized asset. I want you to understand something about that beach house. Chester and I bought it as a wreck in 1989 for $38,000. We rebuilt most of it ourselves over 20 years. Weekends, school breaks, any stretch of time we could string together. Chester laid the deckboards by hand. I painted every room twice because I kept changing my mind. We taught both kids to swim off that dock. There are photos of them sunburned and gap-toothed and laughing, photos I have looked at every single day of my life. An underutilized asset. I told Warren I needed him to leave. He told me I was being dramatic. That was when I said, "Fine, I'll handle it myself." And I meant it, just not the way he meant it. After he left, I sat in Chester's chair, the big leather recliner he'd had since before we got married, the one I'd complained about for decades because it was ugly and it shed. And I didn't cry. I was past crying. I just sat there and thought about the last 10 years. Really thought about it. When Warren's first business failed in 2015, who put in $60,000 to keep him from bankruptcy? When Paula's divorce got nasty and she needed a family lawyer she couldn't afford, who covered the retainer? When Keith lost his job and they were 3 months behind on their mortgage in 2019, who wired money without being asked twice? When Warren's son needed a private speech therapist the insurance wouldn't cover, who paid for 2 years of sessions without mentioning it once? Me, Chester and me, every single time. And when Chester died, 3 days in, my son sat at my kitchen table and called our life's work an underutilized asset. I picked up the phone and called my doctor, not because I was sick, because I needed to talk to someone steady, and my friend group had thinned over the years the way friend groups do when you get older, and I didn't want to burden Simone any more than she was already carrying. Dr. Alicia Park had been my physician for 15 years. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I was done, she said, "Lorraine, do you have an attorney?" I said Gerald Marsh had handled our wills years ago. She said I should call him. Soon, I called Gerald the next morning. He remembered Chester. He was quiet for a moment when I told him what had happened, and then he said, "Come in this week. Let's talk. I want to be clear about something." When I walked into Gerald's office, I was not a woman on a warpath. I was a grieving 69-year-old who had just watched her children treat her husband's death like a business transition meeting. I was not angry so much as I was finally terribly clear. I told Gerald what I wanted. He asked me if I was sure. I said I'd never been more sure of anything in my life. The will was rewritten over 2 appointments. The beach house, Chester's and my hands, our summers, our whole life in that solitaire, would go to Simone outright. The rest of the estate would be divided between 2 charities: the Children's Literacy Foundation, where I'd volunteered for 12 years, and a hospice organisation that had sent a volunteer to sit with Chester's mother in her last weeks when none of us could get there in time. Warren and Paula would each receive $10,000 and 1 personal item of their choosing from the house, enough to know I hadn't forgotten them. Not enough to feel like a reward. Gerald documented everything: cognitive assessment, video testimony, records of the children's financial requests over the years. He was thorough in the way only someone who has seen these situations go wrong can be. I told no one, not Simone, not my neighbour Florence, who knew everything about everybody, not a soul. The months that followed were strange. Warren called every few weeks, always friendly, always circling back to the beach house. Had I thought about renting it out? Had I considered what property management might look like? Did I know what similar properties were going for on Tybee now? He knew a developer who'd shown interest in that stretch of beach. Paula was softer about it, but the direction was the same. She kept mentioning a woman from her church who'd moved to a senior living community and loved it. Independent living, she said. Very nice amenities. Wouldn't I like to be somewhere with a community, with people my own age, with someone checking in? I was 69. I had driven myself to Gerald's office, tended my garden, and walked 2 miles every morning since Chester died because the movement was the only thing keeping me upright. But Paula thought I needed someone checking in. What I needed was for my children to call me just to hear my voice, not to discuss property valuations, not to float the idea of independent living, just to say, "Hello, Mom, how are you holding up?" That call never came. Simone called every other day. She didn't ask about the house. She asked what I'd eaten, whether the garden was giving me trouble, whether I'd watched the documentary she'd recommended. She drove up on Saturdays, sometimes just to sit on the porch with me, her long legs folded under her, talking about everything and nothing. She had her mother's eyes and her grandfather's laugh, and she is, the best of all of us. I asked her once, sitting on that porch in early spring, why she kept showing up. She looked at me like I'd said something strange. "Because you're my grandmother. Because I love you. Because Grandpa Chester would haunt me if I didn't." I laughed for the first time since October. I told her about the will 2 months after I changed it. I thought she deserved to know. She went very quiet, and then she said she couldn't accept it. That it would cause too much damage with her mother and Warren. I said, "Simone, your grandfather built that deck with his hands. I want it to go to someone who will love it the way we did." She started crying, not politely, quietly, really crying, the kind of crying you can't control. She said her grandfather was her favorite person in the world, and she missed him every day, and she didn't know how I was doing this alone. I said I wasn't alone. She was right there. What I didn't tell her yet was that I had reason to believe things were about to get complicated. It started with a text from Warren in April. He'd heard, from where, I didn't know, that I'd met with Gerald. He asked very casually if I was updating my estate planning. I said that was private. He called that evening and the friendly tone was gone. He said he and Paula had concerns, that I was still in the acute phase of grief, that people in that state made decisions they later regretted, that he only wanted what was best for me. I said, "Warren, what exactly do you want?" He said he wanted to make sure I was protected, that maybe, given everything, it made sense to discuss a power of attorney arrangement, just to have a safety net in place. I said good night and hung up. The next week, Paula called. Her approach was softer, wrapped in concern, but she got to the same place. She'd been talking to a financial advisor, her financial advisor, not mine, who thought it might be wise to consolidate my assets, reduce complexity, streamline things. She said the word streamline 4 times in one conversation. I started keeping records. Every call, every text, the date and time, and a summary of what was said. It was something Chester would have done. He was a records man, meticulous, never threw away a receipt or a contract. I had learned it from him, and it had never felt more useful than it did that spring. In May, Warren called again. He was direct this time. He said he and Paula wanted to visit the beach house in June. They wanted to bring their families, spend a week, and while they were there, talk through some important decisions together. He said it in a way that made it sound like a request but felt like an announcement. I said I'd let him know. I called Gerald. I said I thought they were coming to push the power of attorney issue in person, where it would be harder for me to say no, where the grandchildren would be running around and everyone would be acting like a normal family, and I'd be painted as the difficult one if I didn't go along. Gerald said that was a reasonable read of the situation. He said he had some things prepared that I should know about before June. The information Gerald had gathered came from public records, and some of it I had suspected, some of it I hadn't. Warren's commercial real estate business in Atlanta had been struggling badly for 2 years. He had a second mortgage on his house and 3 business loans in various states of delinquency. He was not just interested in the beach house because it was an underutilized asset. He needed it. Specifically, he needed its equity. Paula's situation was different. Keith had been diagnosed with Parkinson's the previous year, something she had not told me, something I had to learn from a document, which broke my heart in a way I'm still not over. The medical costs had been significant. They were managing, but barely. I sat with that for a long time. They were not just greedy, they were scared. Warren was looking at losing everything he built. Paula was watching her husband get sick and couldn't tell her own mother about it. They were both drowning, and instead of saying that, instead of just asking, they'd come up with a plan. I understood it. I didn't accept it, but I understood it. June came. Warren arrived first with his wife Sandra and their 2 boys. Paula and Keith flew in the next day with their younger kids. For about 4 hours, it felt almost normal. Children running on the beach, someone starting the grill, the familiar noise of a full house. I watched Chester's grandchildren playing in the same water where he'd taught their parents to swim, and I had to excuse myself to cry on the upstairs landing for about 10 minutes. Then Warren called everyone inside. He had printed materials, an actual packet. I want you to understand. My son sat down at Chester's kitchen table with a printed packet and a proposal for a family real estate management agreement that would give him and Paula co-authority over the beach house and, with my signature, over my general financial decisions. He walked through it like a presentation. Paula kept saying things like, "We just want you to be taken care of, and this is really just about protection." Keith was quiet. I noticed that. He sat slightly apart from the others, and he didn't say much, and at one point he looked at me with an expression I recognized. Shame. I let Warren finish. Then I said, "I'm going to ask you both something, and I need you to answer honestly. In the last 8 months, since your father died, have either of you called me just to talk? Not about the house, not about finances, not about what I should be doing differently. Just to check in, just to hear how I was doing." Silence. I said, "That's what I thought." I stood up and walked to the front door and opened it. Gerald came in. He had been sitting in his car in the driveway for 45 minutes, waiting for my call. He set his briefcase on the table, opened it, and told my children that before they said anything further, they should know that the will had been updated, that the beach house was already in the process of being transferred to Simone, and that any attempt to challenge the estate through incompetency claims or undue influence arguments would be met with a cognitive assessment from a board-certified neuropsychologist, 12 months of documented financial requests showing a clear pattern, and a very clear paper trail of their own conduct. The room was quiet, the way rooms only get quiet when everyone is doing math. Warren's face went through about 6 emotions. He landed on anger. He said I was punishing them for asking normal questions. He said I was being vindictive. He said Simone wasn't even a real... He stopped himself, but I heard where the sentence was going. I said, "Finish that sentence." He didn't. Paula was crying. She said she didn't understand. She thought we were a family. She thought this was just a conversation. I said, "Paula, Keith has Parkinson's. You didn't tell me. Your own mother. You decided you'd rather scheme than trust me." She looked at her husband. He looked at his hands. "Why?" I asked her. She said, "Because every time I've ever needed something, Mum, there's always a cost. There's always a reminder later. Remember when we helped with the lawyer? Remember when we covered the mortgage? You keep a ledger, and I didn't want to be in debt to you." That one landed hard, because she wasn't wrong. I had kept a ledger. Not out loud, not on paper, but in my heart. Every time I gave something, some part of me marked it down and expected something in return. Not money, but gratitude, presence, the sense that they understood what I had sacrificed. And when they didn't perform that gratitude in the way I needed, I felt cheated. I had taught my children that love came with a tab. Gerald quietly excused himself to the porch. I sat down across from my children and I said, "You're right, I did that. I made every gift into a debt, and I didn't even see it." Warren started to say something and I said, "Let me finish. You're right about that. And you're wrong about everything else. Being right about one thing doesn't make it okay to try to take over my finances behind my back. Both things are true." The room was very still. I looked at Paula. "Tell me about Keith. All of it. I'm your mother." She looked at Warren. He looked away. And then she started talking, and for the first time since October, we were actually in the same room with each other. I'm not going to pretend the next few hours were a movie. There were raised voices and old grievances, and Warren stormed out to the beach twice. But when it was over, when the kids were in bed and Sandra had gone upstairs, and it was just me and Warren and Paula and Keith at the kitchen table with cold coffee, something had shifted. I made them an offer. I was not changing the will. The beach house belonged to Simone. But I would help them, really help them, with conditions. For Warren, I would consult with a financial advisor on his behalf and provide a structured loan to address his most urgent business debt. Not a gift. A loan with paperwork and a payment schedule, because loans are honest and gifts become weapons. For Paula and Keith, I would cover Keith's medical expenses directly, paying the providers, not giving them a check to use however they chose. And I would start a dedicated medical fund for ongoing costs. In exchange, both of them would go to family therapy with me. 1 year, every month. Non-negotiable. Warren said, "You're still punishing us." I said, "Warren, I'm offering you help instead of watching you lose your business. That is the opposite of punishment." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The beach house is really gone," I said. "The beach house is really gone. It was never about the house. It was about the fact that your father died, and you had a packet ready." He looks like I'd hit him. I think, maybe. He finally heard himself. Paula said she would do the therapy. She said she was sorry she hadn't told me about Keith. She said she'd been so ashamed that their life wasn't working out the way it was supposed to. Ashamed to come to me because she already felt like a disappointment. I said, "You have never been a disappointment. You are my daughter." She cried. I cried. Warren went to the beach again, but this time when he came back, he sat down and said he'd do the therapy too. The next morning, Simone arrived. I had called her the night before and told her to come. She pulled up in her little blue car. and walked into the middle of what I can only describe as a very fragile ceasefire. Warren looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You knew about the house." She said, "Yes." He said, "Did you ask her to do it?" She said, "No." She told me after it was done, and I tried to talk her out of it for what it's worth. He nodded slowly. I watched him look at his niece, this young woman who had driven up every Saturday for 8 months, who had not once asked about square footage or property values. And I saw something move across his face. Recognition, maybe, or something like it. Sandra came downstairs with the boys and made pancakes, which is the most useful thing anyone did all weekend. We ate together. It was awkward and exhausting and real. That was 18 months ago. We do the therapy. All of us. The first 4 sessions were brutal. Dr. Maureen Holt, who specializes in family systems and does not let anyone hide behind politeness, had Warren in tears by the 3rd session, and had me admitting things about my own behavior I had never said out loud. That I used money to manage my anxiety about being left, that I'd built my sense of worth around being needed, and when they became independent, I hadn't known who I was anymore. Chester used to say I was the glue that held the family together. I think what he meant was that I was the one doing all the holding, and I had somehow convinced myself that was the same thing as being loved. It is not the same thing. Warren's business is stabilizing. He paid back the first installment of the loan last spring, brought a check in person, which I did not expect. We had dinner afterward, just the 2 of us, and he told me about what the last 2 years had really been like. Not the version he presents to the world, the real version. I think that was the first honest conversation we'd had in 15 years. Paula and I talk every Sunday now. She tells me about Keith's treatment, about the good weeks and the hard ones. She sends me videos of the kids. Last month, she drove down to Crestwood just to see me. No occasion, no agenda, just because she wanted to. I don't know what to do with that yet, but I'm learning. Keith and I have developed our own understanding. He's a quieter person than I ever gave him credit for. I always just thought of him as Paula's husband, which is not the same as a person. He is a person. He's funny in a dry, understated way that Chester would have liked. He got me a book on coastal Georgia birds for my birthday, which is an extremely specific gift that I love. Simone has the beach house. She has not changed a single thing on the inside. She hung Chester's old fishing photos in the hallway and put a small garden in by the back door, tomatoes and herbs, and she sends me pictures of it every week. She brought Lily there last summer. Lily is her best friend's daughter, 8 years old. The kind of child who asks 1,000 questions and means all of them. And she called me from the dock to show me Lily's face when she saw the water. I watched a little girl see the ocean from Chester's dock, and I thought about how a place holds the people who loved it, how it carries them forward even when they're gone. I am 69 years old. I live alone in Crestwood in a house that is too big but has a good garden. I walk 2 miles every morning. I volunteer at the Literacy Foundation on Wednesdays. I am learning, slowly, that being loved and being needed are different things, and that the love is actually better. My will still reads the way Gerald filed it. The beach house belongs to Simone. The bulk of the estate goes to the organizations that meant something to Chester and me. Warren and Paula will have enough, not everything, but enough. And more importantly, they know why. They don't always like it, but they understand it. And sometimes, in the space between what we expected of each other and what we actually are, understanding is the beginning of something real. Chester would have handled all of this better than I did. He was gentler, more patient. He saw people more clearly than I did. But Chester isn't here, so I'm doing it my way, which is slower and louder and involves more crying than I would prefer. The last time I was at the beach house, we all came together. Warren and Sandra and the boys, Paula and Keith, Simone and Lily, who now considers herself an honorary family member. 18 people in a house built for 8. Chester's deck, his boards, holding all of us. We took a photo at sunset. I looked at it later that night, alone in my room. I am in the middle of it. Everyone is looking at the camera except Lily, who is looking at the water, and except Warren, who is looking at me. I don't know what he's thinking, but he's looking. That's something. After everything, that is something. My name is Lorraine. I rewrote my will. stood my ground in my own living room, and almost lost my family in the process. What I found on the other side was not the family I thought I had. It was something harder and truer and worth every bit of the fight. Comment the city you're watching from. I really do need to know I'm not alone. I used to think that giving was the same as loving. I genuinely believed that. If I paid Paula's legal bills, if I covered Warren's mortgage, if I showed up every single time one of them needed something, that was love. That was what a good mother did. And for a long time it worked, in the sense that nobody told me it wasn't working. What I didn't see was what I was building underneath all that giving. Every check I wrote, every crisis I solved, I was also adding a line to a ledger that I never showed anyone, but that everyone could feel. And children can feel a ledger even when they can't name it. Warren learned that asking for help meant owing something. Paula learned that being in need meant being a disappointment. So when things got truly hard, when his business started failing, when Keith got sick, they didn't come to me. They made a plan instead. They brought printed materials to my kitchen table 3 days after I buried my husband. That is what I built. Not because I was a bad mother, because I confused transaction with love and never noticed the difference. Here is what I've come to understand. Slowly, the way you understand things that hurt, what we consistently do, shapes who the people around us become. Not all at once, not dramatically, quietly, over years, in the thousand small moments where we show people how we expect to be treated and what we're willing to accept. I showed my children that I would always absorb the cost of their choices, so they let me. They didn't decide to take me for granted. They were just living inside the world I had made. That is not an excuse for what they did. Warren sitting across from me with a power of attorney document, while Chester was barely cold. That was a choice he made as a grown man, and he owns it. But I can hold two things at once. He made that choice, and I laid the groundwork for it. Both are true. What Simone showed me, without trying, without knowing she was teaching me anything, was what it looks like when someone loves you without an agenda. She showed up every Saturday because she wanted to. She brought food because she thought I wasn't eating. She sat with me on the porch because she liked being there. No ledger, no debt, just presence. That is the thing I had never actually given my children, underneath all the money and the fixing and the sacrifice. Presence without a price tag. I am 69 years old and I am still learning this. The therapy helps. Warren and I had dinner last spring, just the two of us, no agenda. And he told me about a business failure he'd never mentioned, something from years ago. And I listened without trying to fix it, and that was hard for me. But I did it. That is the work. Not grand gestures, just sitting still and letting the people you love be the full complicated thing they actually are. I think about Chester a lot when I'm at the beach house now. He was better at that kind of love than I was, the patient, present kind. I think he would have figured all this out a decade earlier, but Chester isn't here. So I'm doing it my way, which is slower and involves more apologies and more coffee than I'd prefer. The beach house belongs to Simone. That decision stands. But what matters more to me now is that when Warren looks at me across a table, he's actually looking. When Paula calls on Sunday, she tells me the real things. We're still learning. All of us. That's the only honest ending I can offer you.